The gray waters of the English Channel churned violently as Allied landing craft cut through the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944. Lieutenant James Henderson gripped his rifle tighter, watching the pale faces of his fellow soldiers in the dim light. They knew what awaited them on the beaches of Normandy: machine gun nests, artillery positions, and miles of barbed wire protecting Adolf Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Yet none of them could have imagined that this single day would set in motion the events that would ultimately bring down the Third Reich. Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in military history, had been years in the planning. General Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, had spent countless sleepless nights coordinating with British, Canadian, and American forces to ensure this moment would succeed. The weather had been treacherous. Storms had already delayed the operation by 24 hours. Now, as the first light of dawn broke across the Norman coastline, 156,000 Allied troops prepared to storm 5 beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The German defenders, under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had spent months fortifying the French coast. Rommel, known as the Desert Fox for his tactical brilliance in North Africa, believed that Germany's only chance lay in stopping the invasion at the water's edge. He had placed thousands of obstacles in the surf, mined the beaches extensively, and positioned his artillery to create killing fields across the landing zones. As Henderson's landing craft approached Omaha Beach, the sound of enemy fire began to echo across the water. The Wehrmacht's 7th Army, commanded by Colonel General Friedrich Dahlmann, had been caught off guard by the timing and location of the assault, but their coastal defenses remained formidable. Machine guns from the bluffs above the beach began to rake the approaching boats with devastating fire. The first wave of American troops stormed ashore at 6:30 in the morning, immediately facing a hurricane of steel. Men fell by the dozens as they struggled through the surf, weighed down by equipment and facing an enemy that held every advantage of terrain and preparation. The carefully planned timetables began to collapse within minutes as units became separated. Landing craft were destroyed, and officers were cut down before they could organize their men. On Utah Beach, the 4th Infantry Division found somewhat lighter resistance, but at Omaha, the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions faced a nightmare scenario. The pre-invasion bombardment had failed to knock out the German positions, and now those same guns were methodically destroying the invasion force. Bodies littered the water line as wave after wave of Allied soldiers pressed forward, driven by a combination of training, desperation, and the knowledge that retreat meant certain death. According to military historian Stephen Ambrose's detailed account in D-Day, June 6, 1944, the casualties in the First R alone were staggering. Entire companies were wiped out before they could establish a foothold on French soil. By noon, the outcome of the entire war hung in the balance. Radio communications crackled with desperate reports from beach commanders, some calling for immediate evacuation. The German defenders, many of them seasoned veterans from the Russian front, fought with the knowledge that this might be their last chance to prevent an Allied victory in Europe. Yet somehow, through individual acts of heroism and collective determination, small groups of Americans began to find gaps in the German defenses. Colonel George Arthur Taylor's voice cut through the chaos of Omaha Beach like a blade through steel. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach," he shouted to his cowering soldiers. "Those who are dead and those who are going to die now. Let's get the hell out of here." His words, spoken around 1 o'clock in the afternoon of June 6th, would become legendary, but in that moment they represented the turning point of the bloodiest day in the Battle of Normandy. The German positions atop the bluffs had seemed impregnable throughout the morning. The 352nd Infantry Division, a static coastal defense unit, had been reinforced with veterans who knew their business. Their MG-42 machine guns, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute, had created an almost impenetrable wall of fire across the beach. American tanks, vital for providing close support, lay disabled in the surf or buried in the sand where they had been knocked out by German anti-tank guns. But Taylor's challenge sparked something in his men that no amount of training could have instilled. small groups of rangers and infantry began to move inland, using shell craters and the bodies of their fallen comrades as cover. They crawled through minefields, climbed the treacherous cliffs, and engaged German positions in brutal, hand-to-hand combat. Each yard gained came at an enormous price in blood, but gradually, inevitably, the American advance began to tell. Meanwhile, on the British and Canadian sectors, progress had been somewhat better. The 3rd Infantry Division, led by Major General Tom Rennie, had established a solid foothold on Sword Beach despite fierce resistance from the 21st Panzer Division. General Bernard Montgomery's careful planning was paying dividends as British forces pushed inland toward the city of Caen. Though they would find that particular objective much harder to achieve than anticipated, the German response to the invasion had been hampered by Adolf Hitler's bizarre sleeping habits and command structure. The Führer, who had gone to bed late after watching a film, was not awakened until mid-morning, and even then, he refused to believe that this was the main Allied assault. He insisted it was merely a diversion, that the real attack would come at the Pas de Calais. This fatal miscalculation meant that crucial armored reserves remained uncommitted. During the critical first hours, when they might have driven the Allies back into the sea, General Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall German commander in the West, found his hands tied by Hitler's micromanagement and the confused chain of command that characterized the Nazi war machine. The 58th Panzer Corps, which could have been decisive if committed early, spent precious hours waiting for orders that never came with sufficient clarity or authority. By evening, despite the horrific casualties the Allies had achieved their primary objective, they were ashore in force and could not be dislodged. The cost had been staggering, over 4,000 casualties on the American beaches alone, with the British and Canadians suffering additional thousands. The German defenders had fought with typical skill and courage, but they lacked the reserves and air support necessary to throw back such a massive assault. As night fell on June 6th, exhausted Allied soldiers began the work of consolidating their hard-won beachheads. Engineers worked frantically to clear obstacles and establish supply routes, while medical personnel tended to the thousands of wounded. The artificial harbors, known as mulberries, were already being towed across the channel, a technological marvel that would allow the Allies to supply their armies without capturing a major port. The success of D-Day, while costly beyond imagination, had opened the second front that Stalin had demanded for years. German forces that had been transferred east to fight the Red Army would now have to be recalled to defend the western approaches to the Reich itself. The hedgerows of Normandy had become a nightmare of close-quarters combat by late June 1944. Each bocaged the ancient field boundaries of thick earth banks topped with impenetrable hedges. Provy did the German defenders with natural fortifications that turned every farm field into a potential killing ground. American forces, led by Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's First Army, found themselves engaged in a brutal war of attrition that seemed to favor the defenders. At every turn, General Erwin Rommel, despite his growing pessimism about Germany's chances, had proven masterful at organizing the defense. His Army Group B had turned the Norman countryside into a fortress-like maze, where a single machine gun crew could hold up an entire company for hours. The thick hedgerows channeled American attacks into predictable routes where German mortars and artillery could exact a devastating toll. By late June, Allied casualties were mounting at an alarming rate. While territorial gains remained frustratingly small, the German 7th Army, now commanded by General Paul Hauser after Dahlmann's death from a heart attack, conducted a fighting withdrawal that demonstrated the Wehrmacht's continued tactical superiority. At the small unit level, veteran units like the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend fought with a fanaticism born of desperation. They knew that each day they delayed the Allied advance was another day for Germany to strengthen its defenses or possibly develop the miracle weapons that Hitler promised would change the course of the war. However, the strategic picture was slowly turning against Germany. The Luftwaffe, once master of European skies, could barely manage a few sorties per day over Normandy. Allied air supremacy was so complete that German forces could only move at night, and even then they faced constant harassment from roving fighter bombers. Supplies of fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment dwindled as Allied bombers systematically destroyed the French transportation network. The breakthrough came on July 25th with Operation Cobra, Bradley's carefully planned assault near Saint-La. Following a massive carpet bombing by over 1,500 heavy bombers tragically. Some bombs fell short, killing Lieutenant General Leslie McNair and dozens of American soldiers. The Third Army, under General George Smith Patton, Jr., burst through German lines like water through a broken dam. Patton's armored spearheads raced across Brittany and then turned east toward the German rear areas. With characteristic audacity, his tank columns moved so rapidly that they often outran their supply lines, living off captured German fuel and ammunition. The German command structure, already strained by Hitler's interference and the loss of experienced officers, began to collapse under the pressure of Patton's relentless advance. By early August, German forces in Normandy faced encirclement. Hitler, in one of his increasingly erratic strategic decisions, ordered a counterattack at Morton designed to cut off Patton's forces and restore the situation. This attack, led by the 2nd Panzer Division and remnants of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, initially achieved some success against thinly held American positions, but the Morton offensive ultimately sealed the fate of German forces in Normandy. By attacking westward instead of retreating eastward, German commanders had placed their armies in a pocket between advancing American forces from the south and British-Canadian forces pushing down from the north. Military historian Max Hastings, in his comprehensive study Overlord, D-Day, and the Battle for Normandy, described this decision as one of Hitler's most catastrophic strategic blunders, a mistake that would cost Germany an entire army group. The Falaise Pocket, as it came to be known, became a death trap for retreating German forces. Allied artillery and air attacks turned the narrow escape routes into charnel houses, where horses and men died together in the summer heat. The roads leading east from Falaise resembled scenes from Dante's Inferno. By August 17, 1944, burned-out vehicles, dead horses, and the bodies of German soldiers littered the Norman countryside. As to Allied armies converged to close what military historians would later call one of the most decisive encirclements of the Second World War. Lieutenant General Harry Crerar's 1st Canadian Army pushed south while Patton's 3rd Army raced north, leaving the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army trapped in an increasingly shrinking pocket of devastation. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who had replaced Rundstedt as commander of Army Group West, found himself in an impossible situation. Hitler's orders forbade any strategic withdrawal, even as it became clear that continued resistance would result in the complete destruction of German forces in France. Von Kluge, a competent professional soldier, could see the tactical reality clearly. His armies were being systematically annihilated in a pocket that shrank by miles each day. The German soldiers trapped within the Falaise Pocket fought with the desperation of cornered animals. Units like the 2nd Panzer Division and the 9th SS Panzer Division, Hohenstaufen, conducted rearguard actions of extraordinary ferocity, knowing that each hour they bought allowed more of their comrades to escape eastward toward the German border. These were not the raw recruits or foreign volunteers that had increasingly filled German ranks. These were the survivors of years of brutal warfare on multiple fronts, men who understood that capture might mean years in Allied prison camps, or worse. Royal Canadian Air Force pilot squadron leader James Edgar Johnny Johnson later described the scenes below his Spitfire as unlike anything he had witnessed in 4 years of combat flying. The roads were carpeted with destroyed vehicles, he wrote in his memoir, and the stench of death was so strong you could smell it even at 2,000 feet. The Typhoon fighter bombers of the Royal Air Force's 2nd Tactical Air Force worked methodically through the packed German columns, their rockets and cannon fire turning retreat into massacre. By August 19th, the gap between Canadian and American forces had narrowed to less than 2 miles near the town of Chambois. Polish armored units of the 1st Canadian Army, led by Major General Stanisław Maciek's 1st Armored Division, fought with particular intensity. These were men who had lost their homeland to German invasion in 1939 and now saw their chance for revenge. Their assault on Hill 162, overlooking the last escape route, became one of the war's most bitter small unit actions. General Heinrich Eberbach, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, made increasingly desperate attempts to keep the escape corridor open. His remaining armor, including elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, launched suicidal attacks against Polish and Canadian positions. These assaults succeeded briefly in reopening the gap, allowing some German forces to escape, but the cost was prohibitive. Entire tank companies were destroyed. For the sake of saving a few thousand infantrymen, the final closure of the Falaise pocket came on August 21st when American forces of the 90th Infantry Division linked up with Polish troops near Chambois. The psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. For the first time since 1939, a German army had been completely destroyed in the field. Over 50,000 German soldiers marched into captivity, while another 10,000 lay dead in the Normandy fields. More importantly, the cream of German armor in the West had been eliminated. Over 300 tanks and assault guns were abandoned or destroyed within the pocket. The military implications extended far beyond Normandy itself. With the destruction of Army Group B's mobile reserves, nothing stood between Allied forces and the German border except scattered garrison troops and the remnants of units that had managed to escape the encirclement. The liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944, marked not just the end of German occupation, but the beginning of a collapse that would accelerate with each passing day. General Jacques-Philippe Leclerc's 2nd French Armored Division, supported by the American 4th Infantry Division, rolled through streets lined with ecstatic crowds as German resistance crumbled. The symbolic importance of the moment was not lost on Allied commanders. The fall of the City of Light demonstrated to the world that German power in Western Europe was broken beyond repair. General Dietrich von Choltitz, the German military governor of Paris, had disobeyed Hitler's explicit orders to destroy the city's infrastructure before retreating. His decision to surrender Paris intact saved countless civilian lives and preserved architectural treasures that would have taken generations to rebuild. Von Choltitz later claimed that he refused to go down in history as the man who destroyed Paris, but his surrender also reflected the growing recognition among German officers that the war was lost and further destruction served no military purpose. The speed of the Allied advance following the Normandy breakout caught even optimistic planners by surprise. Patton's Third Army covered over 400 miles in less than 3 weeks, liberating vast swaths of France while German forces fell back in increasing disarray. The German 15th Army, which had remained in the Pas de Calais throughout the Normandy campaign due to Hitler's belief in the phantom First United States Army Group deception, now found itself retreating toward Belgium with minimal equipment and plummeting morale. Supply lines stretched thin as Allied forces raced eastward. The famous Red Ball Express, a truck convoy system operated primarily by African American soldiers, worked around the clock to keep ammunition, fuel, and food flowing to the rapidly advancing armies. Despite heroic efforts, logistics were becoming a critical constraint. Tanks ran out of fuel, artillery units rationed shells, and infantry divisions marched on half rations. As supply depots fell further behind the advancing front lines, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group advanced through Belgium with methodical precision, liberating Brussels on September 2nd and Antwerp the following day. However, Montgomery's forces faced the same supply challenges that were slowing American advances further. South, the German retreat, while precipitous, had not become a complete rout. Experienced commanders like Colonel General Kurt Student were organizing defensive lines along rivers and canals that could potentially halt the Allied advance. The German response to the crisis in the West revealed the fundamental weaknesses that would ultimately doom the Third Reich. Hitler's refusal to acknowledge reality led to a series of strategic blunders that accelerated Germany's collapse. Rather than conducting an orderly withdrawal to defensible positions along the West Wall, He ordered suicidal counterattacks and meaningless last stands that consumed Germany's remaining reserves without achieving any strategic benefit. The arrival of 5 rockets over London beginning in early September represented Germany's attempt to change the strategic equation through terror weapons rather than conventional military success. These ballistic missiles, while technologically impressive, came too late and into small numbers to affect the course of the war. The resources devoted to rocket production might have been better spent on conventional weapons and fuel for the armies desperately trying to hold back Allied advances. By mid-September, Allied forces had advanced to within 50 miles of the German border along much of the front. The West Wall, Germany's much vaunted defensive line, had been neglected during years of offensive warfare and was inadequately manned by hastily assembled garrison troops and Hitler Youth units. Intelligence reports suggested that a determined push might break through these defenses before German forces could properly organize their defense of the Reich itself. The stage was now set for the final act of the European War, though few realized how long and bitter that final act would prove to be. The fog hung thick across the Ardennes forests on December 16, 1944, as German forces launched their last great offensive in the West. What Allied intelligence had dismissed as impossible a major German attack through the same terrain, where the Wehrmacht had achieved its stunning victory in 1940, was suddenly terrifyingly real. 3 German armies, totaling over 100,000 men, crashed into thinly held American positions along an 85-mile front, achieving the kind of tactical surprise that had seemed impossible so late in the war. Adolf Hitler had conceived Operation Watch on the Rhine, later known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, as Germany's final roll of the dice in the West. His plan was audacious beyond reason: punch through American lines, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and split British and American forces so decisively that the Western Allies would be forced to negotiate a separate peace. This would allow Germany to transfer forces east to deal with the advancing Red Army, potentially extending the war for months or even years. The German attack achieved initial success that shocked Allied commanders. The 6th Panzer Army, led by SS Oberstgruppenführer Joseph Sepp Dietrich, smashed through positions held by the inexperienced 106th Infantry Division. American units, many composed of recent replacements who had never seen combat, broke and ran in the face of the determined German assault. Within hours, German armored spearheads had penetrated miles into American rear areas, capturing supply dumps and spreading panic among support troops, who had grown accustomed to considering themselves safe from enemy attack. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper's 1st SS Panzer Regiment achieved the deepest penetration, racing toward the Meuse River with characteristic SS ruthlessness. Peiper's battle group murdered American prisoners at Malmedy and several other locations. Atrocities that would steel American resistance once word spread among front-line units. The massacre of 84 American prisoners on December 17th became a rallying cry for troops who had previously shown mercy to surrendering Germans. General Omar Bradley initially dismissed reports of the German offensive as local counterattacks, but the scope of the crisis soon became apparent. By December 19th, German forces had advanced over 20 miles in some sectors, creating a dangerous bulge in American lines that threatened to split the Allied front. Eisenhower, demonstrating the strategic vision that had made him supreme Allied commander, immediately recognized the threat and began shifting reserves to contain the German advance. The American response showcased both the industrial might and tactical flexibility that had become hallmarks of Allied warfare. The 101st Airborne Division, rushed to defend the crucial road junction at Bastogne, found itself surrounded but refused to surrender when German commanders demanded capitulation. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's one-word reply, "nuts," became legendary and symbolized American determination to resist Hitler's last gamble. The weather, which had initially favored German forces by grounding Allied aircraft, cleared on December 23rd. Suddenly, the skies filled with American and British planes that turned German supply columns into burning wreckage. The Luftwaffe, making its final major effort of the war, launched over 800 sorties on New Year's Day 1945 in Operation Bodenplatte, achieving tactical surprise but suffering irreplaceable losses in experienced pilots and aircraft. Patton's Third Army executed one of the most remarkable maneuvers in military history, pivoting 90 degrees north and attacking the southern flank of the German salient within 72 hours of receiving orders. This lightning response demonstrated the logistical and command capabilities that had made American forces so formidable. German commanders, accustomed to the rigid command structure of their own army, could barely comprehend how quickly American forces could redeploy and coordinate such complex operations. By early January 1945, it became clear that Hitler's gamble had failed catastrophically. German forces, initially advancing with confidence, now found themselves trapped in an increasingly narrow salient, surrounded by converging Allied armies. The recapture of Bastogne on December 26, 1944, marked the beginning of the end for Germany's last offensive in the West. But the cost of Hitler's Ardennes gamble would resonate far beyond the forests of Belgium. By January 3, 1945, German forces were in full retreat, having sacrificed over 100,000 casualties and the remainder of their strategic reserves for temporary territorial gains that had already been erased. The Führer's desperate attempt to split the Western Alliance had instead hastened the very outcome. He sought to prevent the final collapse of the Third Reich. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, recalled to command Army Group West after von Kluge's suicide, surveyed the wreckage of German forces with the clear eyes of a professional soldier who had spent 40 years studying warfare. The cream of German armor, the 1st and 12th SS Panzer Divisions, the Panzerlehr Division, and dozens of other elite units lay shattered across the Belgian countryside. More critically, Germany had expended its last operational reserves in a battle that achieved nothing beyond postponing the inevitable by a few weeks. The strategic situation facing Germany in early 1945 was hopeless by any rational military assessment. Soviet forces under Marshal Georgy Zhukov were massing for a final offensive toward Berlin from the east, while in the south, Marshal Ivan Konov's armies were driving through Poland toward the industrial heart of Silesia. The Red Army, now numbering over 6 million men and equipped with thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, represented an unstoppable force that dwarfed anything Germany could field in opposition. Allied forces in the West resumed their advance toward the Rhine with renewed confidence following their defensive victory in the Ardennes. The 1st and 3rd United States armies, blooded by weeks of winter fighting, had gained invaluable experience in defensive warfare while demonstrating to themselves and their enemies that American forces could stand against the best the Wehrmacht could offer. British and Canadian forces under Montgomery prepared for Operation Veritable, designed to clear German forces from the approaches to the Rhine and eliminate the last natural barriers protecting the German heartland, the crossing of the Rhine. At Remagen on March 7, 1945, by elements of the 9th Armored Division represented one of those moments when individual initiative changed the course of history. When Lieutenant Karl Timmermann led his company across the damaged but intact Ludendorff Bridge, he opened a gateway into Germany that no amount of German resistance could close. Within days, Allied forces were pouring across the river, establishing bridgeheads that would serve as launching points for the final offensive. Into the heart of Nazi Germany, Hitler's response to the crisis demonstrated the complete breakdown of rational command authority that characterized the final months of the Third Reich. Rather than authorizing strategic withdrawals to defensible positions, he issued increasingly hysterical orders for suicidal last stands and scorched earth policies that would have destroyed Germany's remaining infrastructure. His infamous Nero Decree, ordering the destruction of all facilities that might benefit advancing Allied forces, was quietly sabotaged by officials who recognized that Germany would need those resources to survive the post-war period. The meeting of American and Soviet forces at Torgau on the Elbe River on April 25, 1945, severed the Third Reich in half and ended any possibility of coordinated German resistance. Photographers captured the historic handshake between American and Soviet soldiers, images that symbolized the successful completion of the Grand Alliance that had begun forming after Pearl Harbor and Hitler's declaration of war on the United States. Berlin fell on May 2nd, following Hitler's suicide on April 30th in his underground bunker. The man whose ambitions had plunged the world into the most destructive war in human history chose death over capture, leaving his successors to negotiate the unconditional surrender that ended the European conflict. On May 8, 1945, the Battle of Normandy, which had begun 11 months earlier on the beaches of northern France, had indeed proven to be the costly triumph that led directly to the fall of the Third Reich. From the hedgerows of Calvados to the ruins of Berlin, the path had been marked by enormous sacrifice and unprecedented destruction, but it had ultimately restored freedom to Western Europe and eliminated the Nazi threat to civilization itself.